We're here today to talk about open source software use in libraries. Our presenters are Tara Bianchi, University Archivist, Margot Duncan, Systems Librarian, and Tiffany Lemaitre, E-Resources and Collection Management Librarian. And we're from the University of Texas at Tyler. Some background on our university: we were founded in 1971 as a 2-year upper-level college. We became part of the UT system in 1979, and in 1997 we became a 4-year university. Our campus is located on nearly 260 acres in Tyler, Texas, with an enrollment of almost 7,000 students. As you can see, our population is mostly undergraduates, but we do offer 43 master's programs and 2 doctoral programs. We have 10 librarians, including our director, and 6 work in public services. As the university archivist, I manage the archives with 1 staff member. Margot and her assistant manage all the hardware and software technology in the library, including our open source programs. And Tiffany helps with electronic resource troubleshooting and also manages acquisitions, periodicals, and does batch cataloging with 2 staff members. So we're a small academic library with a small staff. We are not programmers or specialists in computer science. We were all able to learn what we needed to know for implementing and using these systems on the job. We hope this presentation will show that it's not out of reach or too difficult for institutions to take on open source projects. If it's possible for us, it is for your library too. First, before discussing the open source we use in our library, we'd like to talk about what open source is and some common misconceptions associated with it. Open source is about programs like OpenOffice and Firefox. The source code is available to the general public for free and can be downloaded and manipulated by anyone. As you can see, our first misconception with open source is that it's free. Open source is not the same as free. Internet Explorer is free, but users don't have access to the source code the way they do with Firefox. We also want to go over some of the other major misconceptions associated with open source. Ideas that it's unreliable, unsupported, insecure, and unprofessional. Open source is not unreliable. The majority of sites on the internet are run on one of the largest open source programs, the Apache web server, which is definitely not unreliable. Third, we have large support groups for each of our open source programs through live chats, listservs, wikis, and presentations, just like we receive support for some of our proprietary programs. So open source software is in no way unsupported. In fact, there are even support contracts available for many open source programs. And as an example, we'll talk later about a 1-year service contract we purchased for Koa that was a fraction of the cost of what our previous ILS was. Fourth, some people think that if the source code is open to anyone, it is also very insecure, making it easy to maliciously manipulate and hack. This is just not true. There's a saying with open source that goes, "Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow," meaning that with open source, different users find different bugs, which are quickly removed, leading to faster patching and more secure codes. Also, when a vulnerability is identified in open source software, the response from the community is quick because programmers want to protect their work and those that are using their software. Lastly, just because something is more expensive doesn't mean it's more professional. Many open source programs built for libraries were created by developers for in-house professional use. So just because people aren't charging money for the output of open source doesn't mean that professionals aren't working hard on its development and maintenance. Also, many large corporations like HP, IBM, and the US government invest money and people in the development of open source software. So to say that it's open source, that open source is unprofessional is just not true. So in the last 3 years, we've implemented 5 open source programs. Koa ILS, we migrated from Circe to Koa in 2011. This was the first open source program that we implemented. When we migrated, we had nearly 500,000 bibliographic records, so we were the largest academic library in the US to start using Koa, but there were larger academic institutions using it internationally. Coral ERM, an electronic resources management system developed by Notre Dame. We implemented the organizational and licensing modules of Coral in 2010 while Koa was in beta, and in 2011 we added the statistics and resources modules. Because this was our first ERM, we had to manually enter the information for our 200 vendors, but if you are migrating from another ERM to Coral, there is a data loader available. DSpace, which is an open source software package created by MIT and HP to create digital repositories. It is used by over 1,000 institutions around the world. We've been using DSpace to host our institutional repository since the spring of 2011, and it currently stores about 80 of our electronic theses and dissertations. Archon is an archival management tool for storing finding aids, digital objects, and collections. Archon publishes descriptive information to a website that provides detailed and specific searching of our archival collections. And lastly, we run our library website on Drupal, an open source content management system that allows for easy organizing, management, and publishing of content online. So all of the above open source platforms are hosted in-house and supported by their individual community members, developers, and users. So why go open source? There's popular sayings with open source software that it's free as in lunch, free as in speech, and free as in puppy. And today we're going to talk about how all three relate to our library and the open source that we use. From an administrative standpoint, open source software is free as in lunch. It's gained a lot of popularity recently because of the economy and budget cuts and the fact that open source is free. In our case, the whole open source initiative started because our administration asked our library director to cut a substantial amount from the ongoing budget without the loss of any more staff. At this point, we were unwilling to cut from our content or services, and transitioning to an open source ILS was the only operating expense large enough to meet budget demands. It was also the only change we could make without negatively affecting our students. Our technical service department had also been watching the progress with COA and felt like it had the functionality needed to meet our needs. For our institutional repository, we wanted to provide a free lunch option for our nursing dissertations because we wanted to ensure access to our students' scholarly work rather than have access to it through outside databases or journals. Research was done to figure out what other institutions of our size were using and what open source IR software had the largest community support, and for us the answer was DSpace. Coral, Drupal, and Archon really were free lunches for our library. Before these three open source programs, we were using resources that were already available in-house, like Microsoft Office. We realized they were inefficient and that there were better tools out there to manage our content and provide better, easier-to-use services for ourselves and our users that also wouldn't take away from our collections budget. So in reality, if it weren't for open source, we probably wouldn't have an ERM or an institutional repository at our library. Another reason to go open source. It's free as in speech. So what about open source is like free speech? Well, we have the right to use the software however we like, see how it works, improve it, and share it. For us, it's a matter of freedom. As librarians, we feel very inspired by the open source movement. They support the same mentality of providing a public good as libraries do. Libraries have always provided content for free to their users, just as open source developers provided their work free to the community. We are also attracted to the idea of our work benefiting not only the general public, but also the library community in particular. We are a sharing community, and open source seemed like a natural extension of that idea. The money and time we invest in open source directly benefits all of the libraries using that program. By contrast with proprietary software, it's not always clear who is benefiting from customer contributions. Another reason that the freedom of open source is attractive is that we're encouraged by the quick development cycle. We don't have to rely on proprietary systems that often don't develop much from year to year and aren't necessarily keeping up with the technological trends. The quick development cycle and ability to customize the software as needed without waiting for enhancement requests was very appealing. So now Margot is going to give more details on how the customization and development cycles associated with open source make it free as in speech.
Thank you, Tara. If you've ever requested an enhancement from your proprietary ILS, this may look familiar to you. First, you request the enhancement, then you wait to hear back from the vendor. Maybe you stir up some excitement on their listserv for your idea, and you wait. Then it makes it to the list for voting, and you ask others to vote on your enhancement request, and then you wait, and you vote, and you wait, and you hope. In my experience with the proprietary ILS, this is how the development cycle felt to me. I did not steal this diagram from any ILS vendor. I'm sure they do not intend for the development of their product to slowly move their clients into hopelessness, but again, that was my experience. So here's a different story. This is our experience with the open source development cycle. You want an enhancement, you talk to the community, you get someone to code the enhancement, the code goes through the community's quality assurance process, and the enhancement is included in the next update. For example, Tiffany wanted an enhancement to the COA acquisitions module. I spoke with my assistant at the time, who had coding skills and was a student in the computer science department. He mentioned the program's capstone class, where students work with real live vendors to create real live solutions to their computing problems. I got in touch with the professor, and the library was able to be one of the vendors. What happened is that my assistant, along with his group, it was of course a group project, met with Tiffany to determine what she wanted. The students coded, put it through the COA Community Quality Assurance, and the enhancement was included in a COA update. The whole thing took about 10 months, maybe a year, from request to production. The coding took 4 months only because my assistant was using it as his capstone project for his computer science degree, and we had to work within the class schedule. We all want our libraries to be a place for student learning, but it doesn't have to be limited to books and journals, just the content or services or study spaces that we provide. And in this example, we see how open source doesn't just benefit the library, but also benefits our students on campus who had the opportunity to work with open source and see how open source development works. We were able to give some computer science students an active learning experience in the library. This is just one example of how the benefits of open source are more than just saving money. The most time-consuming thing from our experience were the meetings. You have to be able to explain what you want the software to do and how you want that enhancement to work. This is a difficult proposition if what you're used to working with or working around is what you've been given. But it also frees you to imagine the most useful and user-friendly systems you can, all for the good of library patrons and staff. And although the paradigms are different, there are places where open source and proprietary software intersect. The ways in which the software is customized, for example. Money is always an option. If you contact your ILS vendor for something, you expect to pay for it. And with open source, if you have the money, you can hire a coder, permanent or on a case-by-case basis, or train your people to code. But with your proprietary system, there is a limit to what you can do, where open source customization is potentially limitless. And if you don't have the money, you can still get what you want, but it will take more initiative and involvement. You can partner with other members of the community, you can find a coder willing to work for the glory instead of the money, and you can learn how to code. But however you do it, you're not bounded by your vendor or your product. You're free to help create the best tools for your library. You can customize the software to be exactly what you need instead of a profitable one-size-fits-all solution. There are also some similarities in the development cycles of proprietary and open source software. Like the proprietary structure, if you want an enhancement that will be released to the community, you may need to do some convincing. For example, COA is international. It was born in New Zealand, and there are many COA libraries in the Middle East, India, and Europe, and in some of those places they don't charge fines for late items. Instead, they remove the patron's borrowing privileges for some number of days. At one point, we were asking for some enhancements regarding fines, and there was vocal opposition from a French contingent who told us he thought our borrowing rules were draconian. But we were able to work that out and come to an understanding. And being able to discuss with libraries around the world how we function and learn how they function is a fun and interesting part of being a member of an international community. I know our previous ILS was international, but I just didn't interact with those libraries on the same level. I had no need to. The vendor was working with them, and I was calling the vendor only when I needed to, alone in my basement office. The differences in the support structure are part of navigating the learning curve, and we're no longer able to call a vendor and wait for a solution. Like I said earlier, open source development requires initiative, and the same goes for troubleshooting. You can report a bug, but a developer still needs to fix it. There isn't someone sitting somewhere waiting for customer calls. And in our experience, bugs have been fixed faster, but because we were working hard to find the answer. And also, something you consider a bug may be considered a feature by someone else. For example, COA has a feature to backdate check-ins, as most ILSs do. However, when you backdate the check-in, like for something left in a book drop overnight, the fine is not automatically removed. A bug was entered in the tracking system, and a developer replied that the feature is working as it is supposed to. We're thinking of this as a bug, but from the COA perspective, it's not a bug because it's working as it was meant to work. And in this case, it's considered an enhancement, and if we want it changed, or from our perspective fixed, we'll need to hire a developer or code it ourselves, or we have another option. We can work with the library who reported the bug, or in this case requested an enhancement, and pool our resources in terms of time or money to create a solution for the entire community, or at least that part of the community who uses that feature like we do. And I've mentioned before garnering support for an enhancement, but it's open source and you don't have to do anything. If you don't want to share your changes, you don't have to. You can keep your changes all to yourself, and that's called a branch. The further you deviate, however, from the master branch, the more difficult it will be to get updates. So while we have just a few things for us, like our LDAP authentication, we try to stay as close as we can to the master branch to make our non-coding lives easier, and because we want to share the improvements we make. And finally, the support structure is different in some ways, but in some ways it's the same. Many of our resources, proprietary and otherwise, have listservs, user groups, and wikis. We're all familiar with getting help from these sources. You may have written this phrase in an email to the listserv. I've put in a ticket with the vendor, but I thought I'd ask here too. And frequently we do receive good answers, sometimes even before the vendor has had a chance to send a substantive response. The open source software relies heavily on the community and uses these tools of listservs, user groups, and wikis to do that. As we've mentioned before, there are companies that provide paid support for some open source software, and we're all familiar with that model. When we migrated to Koa, we paid for a year of support because an ILS migration is a really big deal. Everyone wants their mission-critical systems up and running, so the extra support provided a level of comfort. There are also internet chat rooms where developers spend time. Anyone can log on and ask a question, and you're talking to people who develop for the software that you normally wouldn't have access to. You couldn't call on the phone to ask them for help, but they're in the chat, working and willing to help. Now that we've talked about free lunch and free speech, here's Tiffany to tell you about how open source is free, as in puppy.
Thank you, Margot. So now that we've talked about how open source is free as in lunch and free as in speech, I'm going to talk about how it's free as in puppy. Because you may not have to pay anything for open source software, but somebody's got to be responsible for feeding and caring for that dog for the rest of its life. Overall, we've had a net cost and time savings with open source, but that's not to say that it's cost us nothing. Some of these programs have a very steep learning curve. They all require different things in terms of infrastructure to sustain them, and they have a tendency to grow and change over time. One of the first questions we get when people find out we have open source software is, do you need to hire programmers? Who's going to walk the dog? Well, the answer to this is not a simple yes or no answer. It really depends on the amount of money that you're willing to spend on the project and the amount of customization that you expect. Here I have a spectrum illustrating the need for programmers. On one end is the service contract, where you don't need any in-house development skills. You can pay a company like LibLime or Bywater to give you the same level of support as you could expect with a proprietary software. Somebody waiting on the other end of the line to hear customer calls. This requires very little time, but a significant financial investment. In fact, the first quote that we got for a service contract for Koa was higher than a one-year contract with our proprietary ILS. But we did find a vendor who we felt was a good value for us, and that's who we eventually went with. Next, you could manage your open source software on IT skills. This is the we have some time, but only a little bit of money option. You basically need somebody who has the skills to install the software on a server and do some basic IT troubleshooting. If you go this route, you have to be willing to accept the software as out of the box and not do any customization. You could also hire an in-house developer, which requires a lot of time working with a developer and also a lot of money because the skills aren't inexpensive. But this would allow you to contribute to the ongoing development of the software and do regular customization. And you would also have an in-house support system. In between, you could use RFCs, which stands for Request for Coding. This is the sometimes some money option, and it's good if you want to do some customization on the software, but your development needs are irregular or perhaps one time for a certain project. And with this option, you can pay per project, or sometimes you can find people who are willing to work for the experience. Koa is the most complex open source software that we have at UT Tyler, and so it's hit just about every point on the spectrum in the last 2 years. In our first year, we went with a service contract to help us with the implementation and give us a level of comfort moving forward. Like Margot said, we needed to make sure that this mission-critical system, our ILS, was up and running during that first year. It was clear pretty soon that we were going to need some updates and customization to the reserves module, and at that time Margot's assistant had some programming skills, so we used in-house development to enhance the hourly loans functionality. Then I wanted some additions to the acquisitions module, and in that instance we worked with an RFC type model, working with the capstone group that she described. Now COA meets all of our core functionality needs out of the box, and so we're in a maintenance stage, and we're able to manage the software on IT skills alone. With Coral and Archon, we didn't do any development or customization. We hit a couple of IT snags, setting up things like alerts, but for the most part, these systems were very much out of the box. We were basically able to install them and walk away. Drupal requires some very limited programming skills in terms of having to know some HTML and CSS for the setup. But once you have your templates in place, you can manage that software with IT skills as well. With DSpace, we haven't done any development or customization, but we have needed to know some CSS in order to set up the look and feel of the system. And it also seems to require some more complex IT troubleshooting skills than our other softwares. Staffing isn't the only concern with open source. You also need to think about supplies. You've got to get the food and the shots for your dog. This is true of the whole presentation, but I really want to stress on this slide that this is based on our experience. You may need different supplies for your open source projects, even if you implement the same systems that we did. And you could certainly find these supplies at different costs than we incurred. It's all dependent on a number of local factors. But to give you an idea of what we did spend, in our first year of open source, we spent $28,000 in 2011, and most of that went to COA. It was marginally more than the one-year service contract with our proprietary ILS, but we did incur those costs during the same fiscal year. We had some administrative help with this expense because of the promise that we would be able to shrink our maintenance and operations expenses going forward. We spent nothing on our open source programs in 2012 and nothing again in 2013, which is when we started to see the return on our investment after recovering the cost in 2012. We don't expect to always spend nothing, but we do anticipate that the ongoing development and maintenance cost will be much lower than the proprietary systems. The largest chunk of that $28,000 went to a server. Partially because of some university requirements, we were limited in terms of the type of server that we could purchase. Servers vary widely in price, and so if you implemented open source, the largest expense may not necessarily be the server. It's also a little misleading that we counted the entire cost of the server in this price because our server is multitasking. It manages more than just our open source projects. For example, it supports some computers on the second floor of our library as well. The next big chunk of our costs went to a service contract that we've mentioned that we purchased with Bywater to help us with the first year of implementation. And then we also paid extra to have some Bywater representatives come out and train our staff on how to use the system. And then a small amount of money, $250 for a 5-year contract, went to a handle system that we purchased for DSpace, which allows us to create permanent URLs to our theses and dissertations. So now that I've given you some background about staff and supplies, let's talk about value. Is open source a good value for you? Well, it really depends on the extent to which your library values time versus money, and how the open source software you're considering compares to what you already have or are using. Overall, we've had a positive experience with all of our open source programs, but some of them were much more clearly a good value than others. To illustrate our thinking on this, I've created a perceptual map showing the time and financial investment for each of our programs. Let's start with talking about Coral. Before Coral, we had no ERM. We were using the spreadsheets and sticky notes method of electronic resource management. This didn't cost us any money, but it was a very heavy time investment. We could have implemented a proprietary ERM, which would cut back on our time, but would still be a very high cost. Coral was free, small, easy to install and manage, so we were able to spend less time managing our electronic resources without spending any more money.
You could see a similar path when we moved from HTML and CSS as the basis for our website to the Drupal content management system. And while we don't have a proprietary system to compare it to, Archon is similarly a low-cost, light time investment option. All of these were obvious wins for our library. Less obvious, but still a positive move for us, was our ILS migration. Before Koa, we had a proprietary ILS with a high cost that required little time investment. Koa, on the other hand, required a significant first-year investment and a continuing investment in terms of staff time. For us, this was a positive move because we had the staff in place, but had to account for a significant budget cut. Depending on the resource allocation in your library, a move like this might be considered a negative one. An open source investment that is perhaps too early to call for us is DSpace. We're really just getting our feet wet with the system. We haven't set up authentication yet, statistics, or auto submissions. However, we're confident that this is going to be a good option for us because DSpace has an established and active community, and we have no real alternative in terms of buying a proprietary system. We believe that eventually our time investment in DSpace will be rewarded, but we just don't know when our return on investment is going to start happening. Despite being enthusiastic open source advocates, we recognize that it isn't always a good move. SpringShare's LibGuides, for example, is something we subscribe to in the library. It's a very inexpensive product that's very easy to use. We could technically move it to Drupal, but the time investment simply would not be worth the limited savings. As librarians, we are always looking for new ways to be good stewards of the resources given to us. We look at our usage metrics, implement discovery systems, and now we're looking into patron-driven acquisition modules. For us, the move towards open source software was just an extension of that. We want to provide our users with the most we can with what we have, and for us, this was one way to do it. Thank you for listening.